New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the power of the near-death experience. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. Part 1 was with Elizabeth Krohn, and I'm linking to that right now in the upper right corner of your screen. If you'd like to watch that video first, you can use that hot link or check our program listings. My guest today is Professor Jeffrey Kripal, who is the J. Newton Rayzor Professor of Philosophy and Religious Thought and the former chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He is the co-author with Elizabeth Krohn of the book Changed in a Flash, One Woman's Near-Death Experience and Why a Scholar Thinks It Empowers Us All. He is also a co-author with Whitley Strieber of The Supernatural, A New Vision of the Unexplained. His other books include Authors of the Impossible, the Paranormal, and the Sacred, Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superhero Comics, and the Paranormal, Kali's Child, the Mystical and the Erotic in the Life and Teachings of Ramakrishna, and Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religion. Once again, this interview is being conducted on the Internet, so now I will switch over to the Internet channel. Welcome, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Yeah, happy to be here again. Thanks.
Happy holidays to you. And, I thought it's very interesting in reading the book that you co-authored with Elizabeth Krohn, in which you sort of describe yourself as a dull fellow, that she's the one with all the psychic stuff going on. But I remember the interview we did not long ago on your other recent book, Secret Body, in which you made a point of talking about how powerful this writing is. In fact, even in this book, you point out this is not an ordinary book that you're reading. Be prepared to be changed by reading this book. And my sense is that one of your, I would call it a quasi-paranormal talent, at least, is that you are able to stimulate exceptional experiences in people who read your books.
Well, yeah, okay, I think that's true, Jeff. I also think I'm dull and boring, so I think both things are true. I wrote this book called Authors of the Impossible, in which I basically argued that one way to look at paranormal phenomena is as if it was a kind of language or a text writing itself, and that there's something paranormal about particular kinds of writing. And that's why particular kinds of writing invoke or provoke these paranormal experiences, is that it's all connected around language and writing. So I actually agree with you on a very, very deep level, probably deeper than you or I can articulate at the moment. On the other hand, Carl Jung spoke of personality number 1 and number 2, and number 1 was this rational ego bore, and number 2 was this wild kind of unconscious mystic / Gnostic / heretic. And I can relate. I can very much relate to that. I don't have access to number 2 like a lot of people do, but he comes out a lot, and he comes out in my writing, and I would be the first to acknowledge that.
Well, it does seem to me very interesting that when you encountered Elizabeth, she was a person brimming with psychic talent. She'd had this powerful experience of visiting the afterlife, of being struck by lightning, of having precognitive dreams and seeing auras and instantly reading people at a psychic level. But she was so frustrated. She didn't know what to do with it. And you suggested to her, let's write a book together. She told me you suggested that, I think, the first time you met her. And
I did. I could tell instantly that there was this incredible story in her. And her reply to me, which she might have shared with you, is, well, I don't know how to write a book. And to which I replied, but I do. So I wasn't struck by lightning, and I don't dream the future, or at least like she does. But she doesn't write books, so we kind of put our heads together and did this together. I think I also felt on some level that the book would be therapeutic to her.
Yeah.
It would help her integrate these experiences into her social self, into her life in a way that she really wanted to do at that point. And so I had just done one of these books with Whitley Strieber.
Yeah.
So I knew how it worked, at least in that case. And I suspected I knew how it would work in this case. And so it was extremely satisfying to work with Whitley. And I knew it would be really satisfying to work with Elizabeth, and both things turned out to be true.
Mm-hmm. Well, I, of course, found her to be a delightful person, and we share, not only do we share a common Jewish heritage, but we actually share family relationships that go directly to the Lubavitch Hasidic tradition within Judaism, and my life was really, my whole professional career was largely shaped by a dream I had when my great uncle, who was a Lubavitcher Hasidim, although he kept it hidden, when he died, he appeared to me in a dream. So it was like the afterlife was calling out to both of us through the lens of that Hasidic tradition.
Wow, that's great. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the more I talked to Elizabeth, the deeper the Hasidic and Kabbalistic thing got. I mean, we fell down a Kabbalistic rabbit hole there, which actually doesn't show up in the book, because it was a rabbit hole I didn't think the readers would understand without any kind of training or historical knowledge. But we did talk about it a lot, and we still talk about it. And you're very much right about that. It's very much a family thing for her. It's even a genetic thing. Yeah. There's something really remarkable going on there.
I think there is. For example, in my case, when my great uncle Harry died, who was born originally in Russia in a small village near the town of Lubavitch, and was, as a child, a student of the original Lubavitcher Rebbe. Several of his family members, his descendants, had dreams, very powerful dreams about him at the time of his death. And the one that I had was incredibly profound for me. I woke up singing and crying at the same time, which has only happened to me once in my entire life.
This is why, a lot of times in cultural or religious traditions, charisma or religious prodigies are passed on through family lineages. They go from father to son, or mother to son, or mother to daughter. I mean, there is a kind of genetic wisdom there, I think.
Of course, there's this beautiful picture in the book, and I'll just show it now briefly, of one of her ancestors who was also buried in the town of Safad in Israel, which is known for Kabbalistic teachers, and was associated, I believe you wrote, with Isaac Luria, one of the great Kabbalistic rabbis.
Yeah, Isaac Luria, for those who maybe not are as familiar with the tradition, but he's often considered the most gifted mystic in the whole history of Judaism. I mean, he generated entirely original Kabbalistic system in the 16th century. So he's not just another mystic or saint. He's like the saint or the mystic in this Kabbalistic lineage in some ways. And she got a family member buried right next to him. Again, there's something there. And we didn't explore that in the book, but again, it's there.
It is there, and I suppose it's reasonable to think that even if you're a gifted mystic, you're going to have descendants who have a variety of outlooks toward life, but somehow they may all be touched in one way or another by the essence of that mystical tradition. Right.
And there's two. I'm just listening to myself blabber here. I think we speak flippantly when we use the word genetic. We don't, of course, really know how genes work. The more we know, the less we know. And of course, in Elizabeth's system, the mechanism is reincarnation. It's not genetics. She writes and speaks explicitly and extensively about the soul reincarnating again and again. And of course, often, I assume, within the same family or the same culture. So there are different ways of understanding family here, too.
Mm-hmm. I have talked to my Orthodox Jewish relatives about reincarnation, and they tell me in their traditions, and they are very Orthodox, the reincarnation exists, but if you're Jewish, you will always be reincarnated into a Jewish family, which is intriguing because I know some researchers have specifically looked into this and find interesting cases where it doesn't work out that way at all.
No, it does not always work out. I know the folks who study these court cases, children, who remember previous lives. And one of the strong findings of that 60, 70-year research project now is that it doesn't follow any of the cultural paradigms. Yeah. Uh-huh. You can come up with all the karma theory you want and all the Hinduism or all the Orthodox Judaism you want, but it does what it does, and it doesn't follow what we think it should do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true.
So the subtitle of your book, Changed in a Flash, is that basically you're suggesting that Elizabeth's experience, which are very unique to her and her family, are really relevant to everybody.
The second half of the book, which is the half I wrote, is the central idea is that we are changing the afterlife. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think her experience is so relevant to the rest of us. Is, one of the things she comes back with is this notion that the afterlife will, at least the immediate afterlife, let's kind of be specific, will be different for everyone. Mm-hmm. You'll see what you need to see and what you are prepared or conditioned to see, but you're still encountering something very real on the other side. And essentially what I try to argue in my half of the book is that really, since 1975, when we began talking about these experiences, these near-death experiences, as Raymond Moody coined it, to the extent these stories enter our culture and we talk about them like we're doing here, we're essentially setting ourselves and our ancestors, our descendants, we're setting our descendants up to have slightly or significantly different kinds of near-death experiences. Because one of the things we know historically is that these sorts of experiences change from period to period and from culture to culture. You can certainly find things that are similar, patterns or structures, but the content of them changes quite dramatically. And I think this is one of the messages Elizabeth brings back, is that we have some responsibility and some capacity to sort of reimagine ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think the book is much broader than her own experience or her own Jewish tradition or set of traditions.
Yeah, I know prior to the publication of Moody's book, Life After Life, it was almost axiomatic when people talk about death and the afterlife that nobody has ever come back to talk about it. Now, with near-death experience, we have thousands of cases where it seems as if people have come back to talk about it.
Right, and of course, that was never true.
Yeah.
And it displays a profound ethnocentrism because most of the world actually assumes reincarnation, in which we've all died many, many times, and we've come back many, many times. So it simply isn't the case. Sorry, Delilah. No. Sorry, Jeffrey.
That's okay.
I have a young blue healer who's trying to protect me here. But it's an assumption. It's just an assumption that people make out of their own cultural conditioning that we no one's ever come back.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you consider that the whole religion of Christianity is based on the idea that at least one person came back.
Right. Yeah, but there is just one rabbi. I mean, at least in Asia, everybody comes back, you know.
But as you say, we are changing the afterlife by the narratives that we create.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
And that we not that Jeffrey Mishlove or Jeff Kripal or any individual can somehow will a new afterlife for everyone hereafter, but to the extent that we as a collective engage in these conversations and develop, frankly, new values and new beliefs, the afterlife is changing. Or at least the immediate afterlife, the one that people experience and then come back and tell. One flashpoint in that changing of the afterlife, and this was what made Ray Moody so controversial, as you probably know, is that there is no hell in life after life. You know, nobody in that book is judged for holding the wrong set of beliefs. You know, everybody in effect sees the light and has a positive experience. And this is what has made the near-death literature so problematic for a lot of conservative Christians in particular, because they need people who don't believe X, Y, and Z to actually go to hell. That's one of the requirements of their worldview. And so there's been a lot of discussion about negative NDEs as well, which there are as well, but they don't prove hell any more than a single NDE proves heaven.
For a while, I had a psychotherapy practice back when I lived in California and was licensed in California. And I dealt occasionally with people who had near-death experiences and found that even the most positive near-death experiences can be very difficult for people to integrate, especially people who maybe they're living, conventional lives, which often involve a certain amount of lying and deception and the sorts of business practices that are considered normal in our culture but wouldn't really stand up very well to spiritual scrutiny. Once you've had a near-death experience, it's really hard to return to your old lifestyle.
Yeah, the most poignant case of that I've ever encountered was a critical care nurse down here in Houston and San Antonio who worked with veterans, military veterans, who had an NDE, usually in the battlefield. They got their vehicle blown up or they were shot or something, and they had an NDE right there on the battlefield and came back just kind of in awe of this beauty and this light, but also with the conviction that they couldn't kill anyone. And so it was a real problem. That's a real problem for the military. And the critical care nurse was trying to, essentially work with both these wounded veterans, but also with their military superiors, who, of course, often wanted to send them back into battle. And their spiritual experience often conflicted just dramatically with what it was they were supposed to do as soldiers. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there you just have a complete contradiction. And frankly, you see the same. We do have a few really poignant cases of children who remember previous lives in evangelical or fundamentalist families who, again, can't integrate that experience into their worldview, but often end up doing so anyway, really out of love of the child. The love of the child ends up overcoming their religious system. Mm-hmm. So I think there's all kinds of poignant kind of conflicts that arise here.
When you talk about changing the afterlife, it made me think about the ancient Greek mystery traditions. Actually, we know very little about them, but one thing that is pretty well known is that in ancient Athens, the leaders of the society all went through the Eleusinian mysteries, and they came out. They were forbidden to talk about it, but they would all say, "I now know that there's nothing to fear with regard to death." They'd lost their fear of death as a result of going through the mysteries. It does sound like something akin to the near-death experience.
So the difference, though, there, Jeffrey, is we actually don't have a ritual system that we can take people through. One of the things I play with in the book is whether, there are religious rituals. I'm thinking of like what is now called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was actually very different in its origination, but is essentially a meditation manual for advanced meditators that is structured around essentially a death experience or a near-death experience or what looks like one. And of course, you mentioned the Greek mysteries also may have been structured around some kind of religious experience that we don't have access to because they kept the secret. But we don't have that in this culture. We don't have a shared ritual that reenacts the death process and that prepares us for our own deaths. Other than this discussion we're having right now about the death experience. I think that's the only public thing we have at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's up to you, actually.
As I recall, in the Middle Ages, there was something known as the art of dying, which was very popular. And I think it had a lot to do with confessing all your sins before you die. But at least there was that.
But in Catholicism, of course, there is a ritual in which the dying person is anointed with oil and a set of prayers are said. And it's a very ancient practice, but it's only for people who are actively dying. It's not something for healthy or living people to prepare for death. It's something for people who are actively dying. Mm-hmm. So we just don't have that. We don't have that in our culture.
I can imagine a time when people who are absorbing things like this video discussion and the books you're writing and all of the data that we now have about reincarnation and near-death experience and mediumship research, etc., will begin to create new cultural modalities for people because surely preparation for the end of one's life is much more important than our culture normally allows for.
Again, we have nothing. We think about retirement and moving to Florida or something. It's a pretty petty vision of the end of life.
Yeah.
Let's go to the beach and go to restaurants every day. That's sort of our ultimate afterlife, apparently. Mm-hmm. I'm being facetious, but not that. It's unfortunately accurate, I think.
Well, in ancient Hindu culture, the idea was that once you've completed your responsibilities as a householder and you're approaching the end of your life, it's time to go and become a wandering ascetic. And begin to engage in the serious practice of yoga and meditation.
Yeah. Again, that's a culture that institutionalized something, something real and something important.
But I've often thought that maybe it's also a way of getting old people who can no longer contribute out of the house, You go wander in the forest.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to speak to that.
Well, I'm sure cultures are mixed. I don't know of any pure example of anything when it comes to culture.
No, but at the end of the day, if there are human universals, and one of them is death. Yeah. So every culture has to deal with it, even if it deals with it by not dealing with it. We have to treat it somehow. Yeah. And I do think the near-death literature is healthy, and I do think it's a good step in the right direction. Although I think it's often been naive, which is one of the things I try to do in the book. I think some of the near-death literature is essentially an attempt to prove the truths of particular traditions, usually Christianity, and I think that's frankly naive. I think people have Christian near-death experiences, of course, but they also have Jewish near-death experiences, and no doubt Hindu and Buddhist ones as well. So I think that's the real fact we have to struggle with in a more profound way.
One of the most provocative ideas that I got out of your book was Whitley Strieber's comment to Elizabeth Krohn when she kept asking, what's the purpose? Why am I being given all of these precognitive dreams about airplane crashes, for example? And Whitley said, well, perhaps the purpose is for you to help guide the souls of those people who died in those incidents. Right. Yeah.
So that was I invited Whitley and Elizabeth to Esalen, actually. It's been a little over a year now, I think, when they were both there together. And it was extremely confirming, I think, for both of them, particularly for Elizabeth, who at that point was still, we were still writing the book, and she was still essentially coming out of the closet. And she found Whitley's guidance and mentorship, I think, extremely supportive and helpful, particularly around that issue, because she struggled her whole life with why she's having these precognitive dreams of tragedies that she can't stop or really help with. And his point, which was really articulated in the form of a maybe or a suggestion, it wasn't a certainty, was, well, maybe you can go back to that point in time and space and help them transition over. Because, Elizabeth's, one of the convictions she came back from the other world with is that what we think of as linear time is largely an illusion, and that actually the entire past, present, and future already exist right now in a kind of block universe, or as she likes to say, a big layered cake. So if that's in fact true, then there's really nothing, I suppose, stopping one from moving around in that cake or moving around in that block universe.
You actually painted a very detailed picture of what that block universe might be like, with a block universe meaning that all time, past, present, and future exists in the now moment, in effect. And that human beings, we're like strands of spaghetti as we move through time. And you even go so far as to suggest that along that strand of spaghetti that represents us, there's signaling going on from the future to the past and vice versa.
Right. So I wish I could claim originality there, Jeffrey, but I'm really channeling Eric Wargo there.
Yes. It sounds like he has a very sophisticated physical theory.
Extremely. He has a book called Time Loops, which really articulates all of these ideas in a very elegant and really beautiful way, and one that's in deep conversation with the sciences, particularly neuroscience and physics. So this idea of a glass block universe is not original to Eric or me. It's really something that cosmologists and physicists play around with all the time. It's one cosmological model in play at the moment.
I understand it goes back to Einstein.
Yeah, it actually goes back to one of his students named Minkowski, but yeah, ultimately to Einstein. But Eric picks it up to make sense of precognition, which is the phenomenon he's most interested in thinking about. And he really, for me anyway, makes good sense of a lot of these precognitive moments. And essentially what Eric says is that you and I and the brain exist in these three dimensions right now. I mean, I can see you, you can see me in three dimensions, but we're also spread out in this fourth dimension of time from our conception to our death. And that's that spaghetti worm that you were referring to. So we mistake ourselves as three-dimensional objects when we're in fact four-dimensional, what Eric calls tesseracts. The brain for him is a kind of four-dimensional tesseract spread over an entire lifetime. And information can pass both directions along that tesseract. And this is what precognition is for him, is the brain essentially precognizing itself just down the space-time.
So if we look at this cosmological picture, which would be consistent with Elizabeth's experiences, it really suggests that at this very now moment, we have lived and died many, many times.
It all comes down to how big is your now, right? Is it just this, or is it this, or is it the whole universe, And if you live in a glass block universe, the ultimate now is the whole shebang. It's not just this little moment that you and I are caught in because of the way our brains work.
And the implication of that, whether or not the cosmology proves out to be correct, the larger message, I should think, for every reader and every viewer is that we are so close to having a much, much larger vision of reality. We don't need to limit ourselves to our average day-to-day ego-bound experiences.
No, and my point, I make this point in the book, but I've made it in a lot of other places. My point is not that you should listen to Jeff Kripal about what the proper cosmology is or what physics is. That is not my point, because it shouldn't. You should not.
Yeah. You're not a physicist.
Right. And if I claim to be one, you should turn off the computer right away. My point is much more humble, but also much more radical. And it's that if you could imagine living in such a glass block universe, then what was before that impossible, like precognition, suddenly becomes not only possible, but entirely plausible. So what's possible or impossible in your worldview depends entirely on the worldview in which you live.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with reality. Reality is almost certainly way weirder and way stranger than you think it is. And if you live in a world in which we're caught in this linear arrow of time, well, then of course precognition can't happen. But if we live in a glass block universe like the cosmologists suggest, then actually it can. And so that's my point. I write about making the impossible possible. And what I mean by that is how reality shifts for us when we take on a different understanding of the universe or a different understanding of what a human being is.
One of the other concepts that Elizabeth came back with after her near-death experiences is the idea of the dual nature of the soul. One way to think of it, I suppose, is that we all have a higher self or a spirit guide, and that spirit guide may appear to us as an external entity, but it's really part of ourselves.
Right. This, of course, is an ancient idea. Mm-hmm. This notion of the spiritual twin, or the angel as a twin, or the doppelganger, to kind of shift into a more modern German context. And I've written about it in the sense of the humanist too. This notion that there's actually two of us, and probably more, but this conscious ego that we're in is clearly not all that we are. And so for Elizabeth, there's always this other angelic self that is guiding us through life, and that we encounter when we die. And then we reincarnate again and again until we learn the lessons we need to learn, and then we ourselves become a twin or an angel to someone else. And to me, this is it's a kind of a mythical way of saying we are everybody else. We all of these things that we imagine as religious entities other than us are really us. Mm-hmm. And we all share in each other's lives. We actually become one another as we reincarnate over and over and over again. And I think that's a profound world to live in. Mm-hmm. And I think it would change fundamentally how we think and what we value and how we organize our societies.
It sounds as if what you're saying at this point echoes what Larry Dawsey wrote about in his book One Mind.
And again, that's an ancient and very traditional message, at least of the mystical currents within these traditions. It's sort of pure heresy in terms of the sort of public Orthodox traditions, but it's extremely common claim within the mystical traditions.
But I'm also very puzzled by something Elizabeth said, that when she first entered into this heavenly garden, shortly after being electrocuted, she heard a voice, and it was just sort of near her. She never looked at it. And it was her grandfather's voice. It had a distinct French accent, but she said she knew it wasn't really her grandfather at all. She said it was God speaking to her in a voice that wouldn't frighten her, that she would be comfortable with. But then later, I think, within just a few months or a few years of her experience, she received a telephone call from the same deceased grandfather. And this time she said, I know it was really him. Same voice, but he had a message, and it was very personal and about her mother, his daughter, and sharing a message with the mother. She had a lengthy conversation with the grandfather. So the same voice was at one moment the voice of God, and at another moment definitely the voice of a deceased grandfather calling her on the telephone.
Right. So, what's the question, Jeff?
Well, there's so many absurdities in all of this. You are confronted as a scholar with accepting her story, and you talk about that you entered into this relationship with her based on trust. Right. Because on the face of it, parts of it are absurd from a rationalist perspective.
Right. I think, the whole story is impossible from a rational or at least materialistic perspective. Mm-hmm. But again, I think this is what struck me about Elizabeth's story early on, was that, there is this narrative of kind of belief and the sort of the literal truth of what she encountered. On the other hand, Elizabeth says over and over again that I saw what I needed to see and I heard what I needed to hear. She's very aware that these are not what I would call pure experiences, that they're being filtered through her own imagination, her own psyche, her own religious tradition. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's what she meant when she said it was my grandfather's voice, but I knew it wasn't my grandfather. She was trying to articulate this notion that she was encountering the divine, but not directly. Mm. Which, of course, you can't do in Judaism, Jeffrey. You know that. Yeah. And this is why I think also she refused to turn around. You can't see God. Mm-hmm. That's rule number one in the Jewish tradition.
That's right.
You can't see God. So it makes complete sense to me that she would never look around and she would never see anyone, but that she would hear God. That's, of course, very Jewish, too.
Yes.
And you're in a garden. Very Jewish. So, none of that bothers me because it's how a sacred experience or a near-death experience would, in fact, what you would expect it to look like if it were fed through a Jewish filter or a Jewish culture. In terms of the phone call, I'm just thinking out loud here, but my guess is that she would make a distinction there because the content of the call was so mundane. And it only had to do with what her historical grandfather would have known. There wasn't any metaphysical or religious import to it. So I think the content of the two conversations was just so radically different. Mm-hmm. But also, she recognizes that the phone call was in some sense imagined as well. Like if I pushed her on this point. It's in the book. I said, Elizabeth, what would have your husband have heard if you would have handed the phone to him? And she was very quick and immediate. She said, all he would have heard is a buzzing. I understood that what I was hearing was meant for me, and that anybody else would have just heard static or a buzzing. Okay, well, I think that's significant.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that the phone rang and that something was on the phone, but I think she, in effect, was the translator. And I think her own psyche, her own imagination was translating whatever it is she was hearing. And she heard her grandfather's voice as her grandfather's voice, not as God this time, because the conversation was completely banal and had nothing to do with any religious truths.
I thought that it was an interesting conversation for several reasons. He had a message he wanted her to pass on to her mother, and she said to him, well, you could call her directly. I'll give you the phone number. And he said, no, she wouldn't be able to hear me. You can hear me because you've already been where I am.
Right, and you've been struck by lightning.
Yeah.
You've essentially been blown open,
mm-hmm.
and the rest of them can't hear me. So to me, that's significant too, because it confirms for me this notion of what we call the filter thesis, that the body and the brain are not actually producing consciousness; they're sort of actually keeping it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we're more of a filter than we are a producer, or to put it differently, we're much more like an antenna than we are a computer. Mm-hmm. We are not generating this. We are receiving this, and we're reducing it, and we're translating it into a kind of 3D movie that we're starring in. But actually, it's not all coming from inside here. And I think that's what's happening with this phone call from the dead, and frankly, what's also happening with the near-death experience. And that's why trauma is so common in these experiences. You have to blow open or break open that filter for this other stuff to get in. And I think that's why Elizabeth was so paranormally gifted after the lightning strike, but not before it.
Although she had been sexually abused as a child, and there's a lot of literature now showing that people who report spontaneous psychic experiences also tend to report childhood trauma and sexual abuse.
Right. And I've thought that was related from day one. Mm-hmm. I mean, my first book on this Hindu saint Ramakrishna deals with sexual trauma in his early life and its relationship to his later mystical ecstasies and visions. And I argued there, as I argued in this book with Elizabeth, that those two things are not unrelated.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that the trauma produces the vision or the near-death experience. It means the trauma breaks open the person who then comes back together, but later in life has some kind of spiritual experience which relies on that earlier breaking open.
Mm-hmm.
They essentially learn a skill
to
survive the horrible trauma they experienced early in life, and that same skill then becomes crucial to their ability to have and survive the later spiritual experience.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to come back to the telephone call for a moment. I don't think I've shared this with you, but one of my distant cousins, a Jewish distant cousin, Scott Rogo, wrote the original book, Phone Calls from the Dead. And
no, I didn't know that. I didn't know you were cousins. Yeah.
Yeah. And now in England, Callum Cooper, a researcher, has revised that book and updated it. It's now called Telephone Calls from the Dead in his edition. And he's got about 50 cases. And there are, amongst those cases, instances in which the phone was passed around and different people spoke to the deceased person. I think in those cases, nobody knew that they were dead at the time. But it does seem as if, there's something very tangible going on there.
Listen, I know those things happen. I mean, Elizabeth's is the second or third phone call from the dead story that I've been told by individuals who were deeply, deeply impacted by these experiences. These were not casual conversations at dinner parties. These were, in one case, it was a woman who drove hundreds and hundreds of miles out of her way just to spend an hour with me to tell me this story. And all she really wanted was a human ear and a sympathetic, another human being to hear her and not to call her crazy.
Yeah.
And this was a heartbreaking story. And I had absolutely no doubt that it was true. I mean, and I had no reason not to believe her. And she never wrote about it. There's no motivation here other than just human kindness and wanting to be part of a community in some sense, So I find these stories heartrending. Jeffrey, the way I define the paranormal is pretty simple, but I think it works beautifully here. A paranormal event is one in which there is a subjective state in the experiencer that corresponds somehow eerily to a physical event in the environment. So if you remove the physical event, it's not a paranormal experience for me. But if you remove the subjective experience, of course, it isn't either. Yeah. You have to have both of those together. Mm-hmm. And these phone calls from the dead are dramatic instances of that, where they just explode our notion of what's possible, right? Right. When we think of religious experiences, I think all of us assume, these are entirely subjective things that go on in someone's head. They're like hallucinations. Well, when the damn phone rings and it's a dead person, that really screws up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's why I think they're so powerful. Mm-hmm. They just mess with us. Yeah. In really dramatic ways.
Yeah, I actually had such an experience myself.
A phone call now?
Well, it's similar, very, very close to the classical experience. It was 3 a.m. The phone rang. I was dreaming at the time, and I was dreaming that I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine who was deceased. You may know Elizabeth Targ, Russell Targ's daughter. Was a beautiful woman. I knew her since she was a teenager, and she died at the age of 40 as a glioblastoma brain tumor. And at the time, she was conducting research on healing and with a population of people suffering from brain tumors. And she's a very talented researcher. And after her death, there were many examples of her communications through mediums and in other ways. And I had this dream, and she was speaking to me in a dream. And I said, Elizabeth, how wonderful to hear from you. I have heard all about your communications, and I'm so impressed, especially the physical ones, because there were examples of that I knew of. And at that very moment, the phone rang and woke me up. I picked up the receiver because I had a phone next to my bed in those days, and it was just white noise.
Yeah.
On the other end of the phone.
Yeah, see, that's what Elizabeth said anybody would hear in her case,
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And her grandfather told her that how difficult it is for someone on his side of the spirit world to try this form of communication. Said it can only last a brief period of time.
These things just awe me,
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say.
Well, the fact that we can just talk about it in a matter-of-fact manner like this, and of course we're sharing it now on the internet, means that our discussion becomes part of the overall conversation, and I think it creates a little bit more safety and a little bit more context for other people who are having these experiences.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant. The subtitle of the book, again, is One Woman's Near-Death Experience and Why a Scholar Thinks It Empowers Us All. And that's what I meant by empower.
Yeah.
I meant to create a safe space and just talk about these things. And, Elizabeth, as I'm sure she told you, she waited 30 years to tell her story.
Yeah.
She was so afraid of being shamed, and particularly her children being made fun of because of their strange mother. So the social censor is so powerful, and it represses these stories. And so we then think, oh, these are rare, kind of anecdotal, tangential stuff that we don't really need to think about. No, these are as common as human beings are. They happen every day, every minute, all over the world. And the only reason we don't realize that is because of this social censor that's pushing, keeping them all down.
It's a taboo of some sort that is implicit.
We're afraid of our own supernatures, essentially.
Yeah.
And so we imagine they're rare and unusual and weird when actually they're us. That's who we really are. That's what we're really capable of.
And I suspect that virtually everybody, including people who are extreme skeptics, all have somewhere in their lives some kind of a hidden talent.
Yeah, or in their family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the truth is, some of us are so dull and so thick. There's actually none of this in our whole life. And that's what the filter thesis, by the way, would predict.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes the filter's super thick.
Mm-hmm.
So any really sophisticated model we want to play with here, it has to explain two things. It has to explain why people have these experiences so often, but it also has to explain why some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to have as much compassion and as much sympathy for those people to whom it never happens as we do to those like Elizabeth, to whom it is happening all the time. And I think once we arrive at such a model, I think it'll stick, and it won't be right either, by the way. It won't work everywhere, but at least it'll get us going.
Yeah. Well, Jeffrey Kripal, once again, this is a delightful conversation. I'm so happy to be able to share this with our viewers, and I look forward to having many more conversations with you, because I think we're doing a very important service to the world at large just by talking about these things.
I hope so. Well, you are, Jeffrey. You're the one doing this. I'm just blabbing in my library. You're the one doing the show.
I have almost a compulsion to keep these conversations going. At the moment, I'm cranking out 3 a week. But
that's amazing, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
Okay, likewise, and we'll do it again.
Okay.
All right.
Bye for now.
Bye.
3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.